Okay, we're rolling.
All right, this is an interview at the Delmar Place residence, Delmar, New York. It is the 1st of March, 2006, 10:30 a.m. The interviewers are Wayne Clark and Mike Russert. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Virginia Goodwin Holt Cavanaugh, and I was born in Biddford, Maine.
Okay, and what year, please?
1916.
Okay.
I'm 89. I'll be 90 this year.
Oh, very good. You don't look it at all.
Oh, thank you.
What was your educational background prior to entering service?
I graduated from Thornton Academy in Maine, and I was a salutatorian in my class. And then I went to Boston. Simmons College had a training program for the Navy nurse, for the New England Deaconess Hospital. So I entered that, and I graduated from New England Deaconess Hospital in Boston, which is today called Beth Israel Deaconess. And we had all Harvard medical teachers. And then after I completed my course, I was assigned a head nurse and a supervisor at the Deaconess Hospital. And I was in charge of a floor, you call it a floor, of sick people. And then I was in Boston when President Roosevelt declared war on Japan. And the hospitals in Boston were asked to get registered nurses to take care of the projected wounded. So I volunteered. My father was an Army captain in World War I, and his father was an Army captain in the Spanish-American War. So I grew up in a military family, so to speak. My dad always stayed active in the Legion and the military.
Could I stop you for a moment, please? Do you remember where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
When what?
When you heard about Pearl Harbor.
Oh yes, I was actually I was at a party, and we had radios in those days, no television. So I was at a party when they announced they had a big announcement from the president. So everyone, there were about 8 of us around in the living room after having dinner, and so I listened to what he said. President Franklin Roosevelt said we had just lost a big part of our fleet at Pearl Harbor, and they asked for. He said that he was declaring war on Japan. So we were all shocked. We didn't realize, we thought the Japanese ambassador was negotiating in Washington. He was supposed to be, but apparently he didn't. And so we were at war then. And so right away the hospitals in Boston, and of course Boston is a big medical center, and they all were organizing to take care of the projected wounded. Of course, the European War was already on, but we had just entered the South Pacific War. So they asked for volunteers to join the Army or the Navy, and because I was involved in hospitals, so they asked for the hospitals to send volunteers. We were all volunteers. To take care of the projected wounded. So one of the doctors there had been in the Navy, and I talked with him about it and whether I should join the Army or the Navy nurse corps. And he said he recommended the Navy because he had been under the Navy. And he said they always protect the nurses. And he said because the Navy Nurse Corps teaches the corpsmen. We have to be teachers. And the Army didn't. You know, they had a different type of hospital administration. So he suggested I join the Navy. because I was already a teacher at the Northern Dickens Hospital, and I'd been there 4 years and, as a supervisor. So I decided I would, so I called the Red Cross in Boston, and they were looking for help, you know. And so they immediately sent me to Chelsea Naval Hospital, which was the Navy hospital in Boston Harbor. So I went there, and I had the interview, and right away they wanted me to come in. And so I had all the preliminary, you know, treatment and physicals and so forth, and writing things. And so then I received word that they had just were organizing the Navy Nurse Corps for the South Pacific. And would I like to join the Navy Nurse Corps? And I said I would. So I joined the Navy Nurse Corps, and I called, I think, in March of 1942, right after the war was declared in the Pacific. And so I served at Chelsea Naval Hospital a few months for orientation and so forth.
Was that a basic training, or?
Well, it was Navy training for wounded. And while I was there, I had a class full of, we had corpsmen that did the actual nursing, and the Navy nurses were in charge. And we taught the corpsmen. The corpsmen were young recruits that came into the hospital corps.
Now, were you commissioned at that point as a lieutenant, or?
I was an ensign.
An ensign, okay.
And so I had a class full of young recruits that were called corpsmen. We also had what they call the pharmacist group, and we taught them nursing procedures and medical procedures, because they would go into the war zone and take care of the wounded Marine. Being in the Navy Nurse Corps, you had the Marine who did the bulk of the fighting in the South Pacific. Army was in the North. And so I had a class full, I taught, and about 100 corpsmen, I think it was. And I also was on duty in the wards to take care of the wounded. We had a few from Guadalcanal, and they had come in, and during the explosion of their ship, they were thrown from the top of the ship to the water, and their backs were, you know, broken and so forth, and they had a lot of injuries. We had a few of those. And so after I was there a short time, one night I was on call after day duty, and they told me they had rescued a Norwegian sailor. I mean, they didn't say Norwegian. A sailor was picked up at sea after his ship was torpedoed by a German U-boat. Well, at that time, I didn't realize that German U-boats were in this side of the Atlantic. You know, they were nearly in England, off the coast of France and so forth. So anyway, I was on call, and they told me to report to the operating room right away, which I did, and the seaman was brought in, and he was unconscious, wrapped in blankets. Both legs had been blown off during the explosion of the ship. And, but the cold, icy water had seared his stumps, so he didn't bleed to death in the water. And he didn't know his legs were missing. The Navy doctor was there with me, and he was unconscious, and we treated him, and he treated his wounds of his stumps. And then all of a sudden he took a turn for the worse. So the doctor said to me, Ensign, get up on that table. This is the operating table. This is 1942. It's different today, of course. And so I got up on the operating table, and he told me to give artificial respiration, which I did. This was a young seaman, about 16 years old, from Norway. And So I did, and while I was giving him the treatment, he regained consciousness. Well, you can imagine how shocked he was. I was giving him artificial respiration. So anyway, I told him he was in a U.S. Navy hospital and we were going to take care of him. And he then spoke, and he spoke in broken English. He couldn't speak English like we know it. And so he said to me, "Would you hold my hand?" That's how he talked. Couldn't say hand and so forth. So the doctor nodded to me. I could stop the respiration. He had given him chloramine, which I helped administer to him to bring him to. And so I got off the table and held his hand. The Navy doctor was there with me. And he told him he was going to take care of him with me and sew up his stumps. He didn't tell him the stumps because we didn't want him to know his legs were gone. And so he told him he was going to sew up his wound. And the kid was pleased, and I held his hands while the doctor. And then after that episode, they asked for volunteers to go to overseas to take care of the Marines. The Navy did. Well, of course, I didn't know what I was getting into, naturally. So I said, I guess I'll volunteer for overseas duty. The next thing I knew, I received orders for San Francisco. And I was put on a troop, not a plane, but a
ship or transport?
No. The rail system.
Oh, okay.
Train.
Yeah.
Train.
They were transporting them from Boston to the West Coast to go overseas. And my mother and father came up from Maine, and my cousin, and saw me off, and the Marine put me aboard the train. And I was 2 days overnight in the train. I didn't know anybody. And then when I arrived in San Francisco, we arrived in that little town opposite San Francisco. A Marine met me and took me to my hotel. And there I joined other Navy nurses. And I had never met anybody before that. And they came from all over the country.
Can I ask you a question? How did your father, being from the Army, feel about you joining the Navy?
He couldn't understand.
How did your parents feel about you volunteering
Well,
to
they
go to
were
the Pacific?
shocked. They were both very upset. But I was independent, shall I say. And I had been on my own, for 4 years. I was 25. And so he was glad, I did doing what I was trained to do. So the next thing I knew, I was in San Francisco. I was at a hotel. And I joined other Navy nurses from all over the country. So eventually there were about 20 Navy nurses that came from all over. I was the only one from Boston. And then we received word to report to a certain dock. We had transportation all the time. We were well, taken care of. And I looked, and I went to one dock, and they said the ship had just moved. See, there was high security in 42. The Japanese submarines were operating right off the coast. And so I was then moved to another port with the other nurses, and I boarded a large troop transport in San Francisco. And there were 20 of us Navy nurses, and we were in the high deck, the A deck, away from the others. And we had thousands of Marines aboard. which were in the bottom decks. We could see the bottom. And many of those later died or were wounded. And a few of them officers we talked with on the top of the deck. And we sing songs with Marines down below, you know, and which we didn't associate with it. But we were always protected day and night. There was a Marine with a gun outside our stateroom all night long. You could hear him marching. We were always protected. And but we had a very eventful voyage to the south. And I think it was nearly 3 weeks at sea. And when we were dodging, you know, zigzagging like they did, and dodging that Japanese submarine. It was very frightening time. And then when we neared New Caledonia, a submarine lay in our path. So a Navy bomber eventually came and dropped bombs around the ship. And we were at our station to abandon ship because I was so immature. I didn't realize we probably wouldn't know what was happening if we were actually bombed, you know. But anyway, we saw the slick come up on the water from the bomb that hit the submarine. And then when we neared New Caledonia, unbeknown to us, we were not told this. The ship was too large to go into the harbor of New Caledonia, because the harbor was mined, and this was a very large ship. And so we were told, just at the last moment, we were told we would have to go down a rope ladder from the top of the A deck, and you know a big ship is very high on the A deck down, and jump into a Navy skiff at the bottom. And the officers were in the skiff, some officers, and would catch us if we missed. Well, I looked down, and it was one of the most frightening things in my life. I hate heights. And I looked down, it was like looking down from the Empire State Building down to the bottom, and I'm supposed to go down a swaying rope ladder on the outside of the ship from the top at the bottom, let go, and jump into a Navy skiff. If anybody had ever told me that, I would never have gone. So you don't know what you're getting into. So that was one of the most frightening experiences in my life. But anyway, I made it.
You made it.
I made it, or I wouldn't be here. And then when the skiff there were, at that point, 20 Navy nurses. And half of them would go to a new hospital in New Caledonia, which is where we were out in the ocean and outside of Numia. And the rest of us, we weren't told where we were going, but at the last minute they told us another ship would take us to way down south to Auckland, New Zealand. So I was in the group, the 10 of us went to Auckland, New Zealand. We were the first Navy nurses in the South. And at Numia, the skiff took us into the harbor. And we always had a Navy officer assigned to us for our safety. And he had a Jeep, and well, I guess it was a Navy assigned Jeep. And he took us all around the island to show us the island of Numia. And at that point, they had an Army hospital up in the hill. So we went to the Army hospital and toured that, and they had wounded, and they were Army wounded, and this was an Army hospital. And they said that most of them were pilots that were shot down, and they had nervous breakdowns from their experience. And they asked us if we would be willing to go to the mess hall and put on a record and dance with someone. They were being ready to go back to the States. They had been rehabilitated. So we said we would, the 10 of us, so we did. We had a great time, you know. And so after that record playing, they took us back to the harbor, and there was another ship waiting for us. And we boarded the ship, and that took us down to Auckland, New Zealand. So it was quite an experience going overseas, and frightening in many ways. And fortunately, I was one of the few that didn't get seasick, but I fought it, you know. But it was a rough trip all the way from San Francisco. And anyway, when we arrived at the Navy Hospital in Auckland, New Zealand, there was no place for nurses. It was just a group of Quonset huts about 3 miles from the center of Auckland, New Zealand. And there were no quarters for women. So then they had to hurry around and find us a place, and we stayed at a bed and breakfast place in downtown Auckland. And then later on, they devised that we would go into a home in Auckland that would take us in until a quarters could be built for the women. There were 10 of us. So we stayed in that quarters in the Army Navy places a few months. And then I don't know what the routine was, but they advertised for people to take in American Navy nurses.
Now, were you the only nurse with one family, or were there a couple of you staying with one family?
You mean a New Zealand family?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what they did, apparently, I lived, the one that chose me was a Navy, was a Army, he was one of the high-ranking Army, New Zealand Army, and his family. And his wife was a teacher, and they had 3 children. One was my age, and one son was in Australia, medical school. So there were 2 girls, and then her mother lived there. So it was a big ranch all in one firm.
Oh.
And her mother had the first few rooms on the left, and they had several bedrooms. I had the first room on the right. But they advertised apparently, and different ones interviewed us, New Zealand. And so they knew, you know, our background, I suppose, I don't know. But anyway, I lived with them about a year until the Americans were able to build quarters. You see, the Navy hospital was only Quonset huts, and they had quarters for the men, but nothing for the women. And it was a very interesting experience, and I had a wonderful relationship with them. And the hospital would have one of the corpsmen drive me to their house, which was actually right around the corner from the hospital. And he was a New Zealand colonel, and he would travel, and he'd come in sometimes during the night from several days away. He was involved in the war, in the New Zealand war. He was Army. But they were lovely people.
Did our government ever compensate them for having someone stay with them?
know.
Did you know? I was just wondering if you knew.
Yeah, I was not involved.
Did you eat all your meals with them or at the Navy hospital?
The what?
Did you eat meals with them or did you have them at the hospital?
Well,
area?
both. If I was off duty, like I might have a day off, I often ate with them. This would be a weekend. I'd work all day at the hospital. And sometimes after day duty, a ship would come in with 500 wounded from the island fighting, and we'd have to go back on duty and take care of it all. And that type of thing. Well, we worked every day. We worked hard, you know, a lot of. But the corpsmen were wonderful. They were many of them were very young, you know. Some were nurses, very few were really nurses. Most of them were trained in the hospital corps, the Navy hospital corps.
Now these were all American corpsmen?
Oh yes, we had all Americans that took care of the American wounded. But it was hard seeing them coming in from the island fighting the Japanese. As you know, they were very cruel, very brutal. And sometimes we'd hear of one that had been captured by the Japanese and tied to a tree and javelins thrown through him. And of course, he went mental, you know, and he died of his wound. Well, we had one like that. It was, I was in charge of a Quonset hut. See, these were all Quonset huts. And I had corpsmen under me that took care of the wounded, and I helped with the severe one. And then I had to handle all of the, you know, it was a great trauma for these young kids, Marines, to find out they're paralyzed for life. And I would have to talk with them, you know, that type of thing. And I would help take care of the ones.
What was your equipment like? Now, you had started out in the hospitals in Boston. Was it, did you have the top equipment? But
well, you know, 1942.
Yes, I know, for the time.
It's not like today.
Yes, I know that for the time.
We didn't have the machine.
What was your equipment like?
We didn't have the antibiotics. Now, what World War II did develop after the war is from our experience. For example, if we had a hospital ship coming in with 4 or 5 wounded, and we had every bed filled, we'd have to get those that we could get up in a chair to make room for the more badly wounded. So we did that a few times with appendix cases. See, we'd get appendectomy cases from a ship, for example.
Right.
And we'd have to operate and take care of them until they could be up and around. In those days, they'd be in bed a few days after an operation. Well, we found out they did so well getting up after surgery that they changed that. Nowadays, today, after major surgery, they get you right up out of bed as soon as possible. And that prevents the blood clots. They used to die with blood clots, you know, from major surgery, because they stayed in bed for days. And they, especially eye treatments and things, you know, like that, abdominal operation. So it was quite an experience. And another thing is we'd get the badly burned cases from ships that had been torpedoed by the Japanese. And they'd be badly burned all over their body because they wouldn't live, the worst one. But we had sulfur powder that helped with the wound. But we didn't have, like today, all kinds of antibiotics. They hadn't come in. They came in right after World War II. So that was a new thing. We didn't have the antibiotics. But they had, we gave excellent care. The Navy doctors were very kind, very competent. And they came from big hospitals all over the country. And they had good care. And they were so grateful, the kids, the wounded, as I see in America. Navy.
Now, you mentioned you became ill while you were over.
Well, at the end of '43, we were going down one afternoon. We had an afternoon off, and we were bicycling downtown. We were 3 miles, and I passed out, and I was hospitalized. And they told me afterwards it was my heart. Well, later I found out it was not my heart; it was my kidneys. And I had developed acute pyelonephritis, which is kidney disease. And I had a lifetime. My kidneys failed 35 years ago. And I had excellent doctors here, and they were able to diagnose with a new treatment what my problem was. And it seemed that they finally decided I had had scarlet fever twice in childhood, and it damaged my kidneys. A little bit of the heart, but it was the kidneys. And so I've had a lifetime, you know. So I'm better today than I've been in years from the kidney pain, but I still have to be treated every day. So, but fortunately I know how to take care of myself, so that helps, I think, in recovery and treatment. And I've had excellent doctors here in Albany.
Now, how many doctors were there in your hospital? Do you
I
recall?
really don't know.
Okay.
We had a doctor. See, they were all specialists because we had orthopedic specialists. Many patients had arms and legs cut off. When they used to, the ships used to land the Marines, and they'd have to go ashore in the water. The Japanese were embedded ashore, and they machine gunned as they landed. So many died on the beaches, and the ones that didn't die were wounded. And few escaped, but the Marines had terrible injuries. And they were a wonderful group of men. They were young kids, you know, wonderful. I can't say enough for the corpsmen.
How many could your hospital treat at a time? Do you know?
Well, we'd have about 400 or 500 wounded coming in from a ship. So I don't know exactly, you know, what number.
How long did it take the ships to travel from the islands to the hospital?
Well, it depended how close the island was to New Zealand. We were way down, you know, beyond Australia. And
So it probably took a few days at least?
I don't know. I can't say.
Okay.
But they would be treated at the island by the Navy corpsmen, taken to a ship and brought down. We didn't have many planes then, but the war effort was superb in the U.S. And due to the war effort, you know, we lost most of our fleet. It built up. And they were able to build more ships and more planes. The planes became more modern, shall I say. And they brought wounded down, and the planes brought a lot of wounded eventually. And then we had, in the Pacific, we had hospital ships that would take some of the wounded from the islands and treat them on the hospital ship, and then bring them to the Navy hospital. See, we were then, we were mobilizing a group of Navy hospitals. Mine was a number 4. There was 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth on the different islands, you know. So I don't know exactly the number. But it's an experience you'd never realize you were going through, you know what I mean? Because you're trained for it and you just act, you know.
Now, how long were you there in New Zealand?
In New Zealand, 42 to 44. I came back in June of 44, and one of the Navy officers from Guadalcanal brought one of his classmates at MIT down to my hospital, and I married him as I returned to the city. I met him, and 2 years later we were married. And so as soon as I arrived in San Francisco, he received orders. He was in one of the islands building airstrips. He was a Navy engineer. And I had a Marine patient that I found out was going back to his unit. So I asked him to take a message back because the ship was slow. And so he took the message back that I was leaving New Zealand, going to the States. And the day he received my message, he enlisted a Marine that had recovered from an injury. He took the message to him, and the day Dave received the message, he received word that his duty was over and he would go back to the States. So he wired me at the hotel. He knew what we had, arranged, whoever arrived first in the States. We had both been over about the same number of times, from Pearl Harbor, 42 to 44. And he wired me several telegrams or sent codes and so forth to wait for him in San Francisco. And we'd be married there before we went home. So at that time, Navy nurses couldn't marry and stay in the service. So that was changed only about 10 years ago. Now they let Navy nurses marry and stay in the Navy nursing corps. So I resigned in San Francisco and was married 2 days after he arrived on his ship. So from then on, I traveled with him. We were together 40 years when he died. So.
Now you mentioned, did you meet Eleanor Roosevelt, or?
Yes, in fact, I had met her twice.
Oh.
And the first time, it was when I was a head nurse in Boston. She toured. She was very interested in ill people. And she was compassionate. And so she toured New England Deaconess Hospital. And I escorted her around my ward. I call it the ward. It was a big floor patient. And she was very gracious. And then when I was in New Zealand, we were told she, against the rules, she had appeared in the Pacific, because we were under war, And she wanted to tour the wounded. So they were shocked. I shouldn't say this, but they didn't want her near the war zone. But she had a mind of her own. So anyway, one of the hospitals she toured was New Zealand, the U.S. Naval Hospital in Auckland, New Zealand. So I took her around my ward.
Did she remember you from Boston?
No, I didn't mention it because she was so involved. She walked, each one of the patients she went to and said that, asked them where they were wounded. And they blurred out which island it was. They were all Marines, except a few Navies. And the Navy, of course, was involved with Marines all the time. And so she'd asked each one and said that she came on behalf of the president to thank them. She was very gracious. And then I showed her each patient, talked with her each patient, and she talked with me, and so forth. And then the Admiral William Halsey was one of the chief negotiators in the South Pacific for the Americans. And he's very famous now. He was a Naval graduate. And there were two other admirals that were in charge with him. But anyway, he was the one that was interested in the wounded. And he came down to our hospital. And the officers of the hospital gave him a luncheon in downtown with the 10 Navy nurses. And he shook hands with each one of them. And he told us how proud he was for us going into, the war zone and taking care of the wounded. But he was a wonderful, compassionate admiral. He also was in charge of the sea battles between the American and the Japanese fleet, and he won, you know, the Japanese fleet. He surpassed them, and they had top equipment, the Japanese. But the Japanese, when I went over in 42, the Japanese controlled all the South Pacific Islands. It was a great, I should say, adventure for our American Marine and Navy men to go in and fight them after they landed. You know, you can imagine they were entrenched in the foxhole and things. And Guadalcanal was our first victory, you know, for against the Japanese. They had a strong force, both naval and of course the Army was strong in the North Pacific.
Now, was your husband ever sent back overseas?
No, because we didn't go back till 44.
Yes, right. I didn't know if
The
he
war
was.
ended in 45.
Yes. Do you remember where you were when you heard about the death of President Roosevelt?
When I heard about his death,
Yes.
I might have been in the Mojave Desert, and I forgot now just what year was it.
In 45.
I think it was April of 45.
April of 45.
What?
April of 45.
April of 45. 45, I was in the Mojave Desert in California. My husband was one of the Navy engineers that built it was then called the Naval Ordnance Test Station. And they had pilots, Navy pilots, testing rockets. And one of the pilots crashed testing a rocket while I was there. His name was Edwards, Lieutenant Edwards. So they changed the name from Naval Ordnance Test Station to Edwards Air Force Base.
Oh, okay.
So it's now Edwards.
Yes.
And my daughter was born there in a Navy dispensary. They had no hospital. And they had this dispensary, about 6 people, I guess they could come. Two of us Navy wives had babies there. So when the war was over, Dave received orders, and I guess it was close to 46, and we came back east.
Was there a celebration there when the war ended? Do you recall that, or?
You know, I can't
No, that's
say
okay.
it specifically.
Okay. Now, your husband left the service in 46,
Yeah.
you said then? Were you ever...
He left the reserves after that.
Okay.
He was still, we were both reserves. But he didn't want to go back, you know, into the service. He went through a lot, the trauma, fighting. He didn't actually kill people, but he had to build the airstrips for our planes to land.
He was in the Seabees then?
Seabees,
Yes.
right, 6 Seabees. They called it the Fighting Seabees. And they received a presidential unit citation for Guadalcanal. He went in Guadalcanal with the 1st Marine Division in 42. And as I said, they were the first American victory over the Japs in the island. But it is an experience that you never forget, you know. You can't forget it because it's so unreal almost.
Were you ever allowed to use the GI Bill, you yourself?
Yes, after the war, I went under the GI Bill to get a bachelor's degree. But I received the points in different colleges in different states. So I didn't get it at the end. I had to have it 2 years in one college. And we lived in different places because my husband was an engineer. And he would be in charge of construction job. And so we traveled for 10 years after we were married.
I see you worked in Albany, Veterans Hospital.
Yes, I worked there a few months.
Okay.
And they were all Korean patients.
Oh, Korean
And they
War.
were all alcoholics. With, I had wards filled with them. It was very sad. They had started drinking during the Korea War. And they were all dying.
Did you ever stay in contact with anyone that was in service with you?
I still do.
You do?
I have two Navy nurse friends. One lives at the Cape and the other in Kansas. But the one in Kansas I haven't seen, but we correspond. And the one at the Cape I see regularly. I did till I became feeble now, shall I say. Because I'm 90 this year.
Yes,
You know, so
yes.
I don't get around this way I did.
How do you think your time in the service changed or had an effect on your life?
It affects all your life. You can't get over it. It's a big part of your life. And you also become more aware of other people and their religions are different and you're just as good as you thought yours was. You know, you become more compassionate, I think, and more compassionate toward the wounded kid.
Of course, you met your husband too.
What?
Of course, you met your husband there too.
Yeah. Well, he was a wonderful guy, I will say that. But I've been a widow now 22 years. It's not easy living alone. But I have a wonderful daughter. She lives in Delmar. And she just lost her husband. So he was 10 years old and she was 60, you know. And she'll be 61 this year. She was born in Mojave Desert. But I am blessed with her, and I have two grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. So I have a nice family.
Well, thank you very much for your interview.
Well,